Welcome back to Taiwan versus the world. Today we will speak with two people who attended the Singapore Air Show and who will share their insights on the future of unmanned vehicles, how they can be countered, and what all this means for Taiwan. But first, we will talk with two European analysts who explored the relationship between Central and Eastern Europe, Taiwan, and China, and walk us through their findings. Today we will talk about a country that we don't hear about enough, and that's Romania. We have two people with us who have looked into Romania's relationship with Taiwan, and this serves also as a good example of the kind of diplomacy that Taiwan is conducting with Central and Eastern Europe. So today with us is Ivana, Karásková, and Andreea Leonte. Ivana and Andreea, welcome.
Thank you, Sudan. It's a pleasure to be here.
I would kindly ask both of you to introduce yourself.
My name is Ivana Karásková. I lead the China team at the Association for International Affairs. That's a Prague-based NGO and a think tank. I'm also a senior researcher with the Supply Chain Resilience Center at the Faculty of Social Sciences, Charles University, and I have been looking at Chinese foreign policy for more than 25 years now.
And I am Andreea Leonte. I am a China fellow for at the Romanian Institute for the Asia-Pacific Studies, and I'm also a municipal councillor in Bucharest.
Thank you both. And I believe you also worked with China observers in Central and Eastern Europe, which is known by the acronym CHOICE. Can you tell me more about CHOICE?
Of course, very happy to do that. So we have been around for more than 9 years now. And we have been looking at Chinese activities in Central and Eastern Europe, starting roughly from the Czech Republic and going towards Russia, so including Ukraine. And on the north, we cover the Baltic states down to the south to the Balkan states. But that's a very artificial grouping, I would say, or the geographical denomination is very artificial because we have been also looking at Chinese activities in Western Europe. And we have more than 230 China analysts now in the network. So we cover basically everything you can think of in terms of China.
I have known China observers since 2017, I guess. And since then, I have co-authored reports and I have written some articles for China observers. And I'm really, really honored to be part of this network of Central Eastern European researchers.
And Andreea, actually, you are the one who reported with CHOICE about the Foreign Ministry of Romania recognizing Taiwanese travel documents. Can you tell us a bit more about this? First of all, it's a surprise. Was Romania not accepting travel documents from Taiwan before?
Yes, that is exactly right. It took the deterioration of US-China relations, EU-China relations, a global pandemic, and the war of invasion against our neighbor Ukraine by Russia to finally slightly improve our attitude towards Taiwan. Indeed, for a start, Taiwanese people, citizens and business people can now enter Romania visa-free using their passports. Taiwan was under a visa-free regime before, but at the border, Romanian authorities did not recognize their travel documents. So they had to wait 4 hours in the airport, sometimes even 4 days, until they were given clearance for entry. And as a matter of fact, the Romanian authorities would provide them with a piece of paper signed and stamped by Romanian authorities, and then they were permitted entry in the country. Unfortunately, this resulted in a rather hostile attitude towards Taiwan, and this has impeded any development of economic relations because, investors will not come and entrepreneurs will not come to invest in a country that makes it so difficult to simply come and visit. And if you're interested, I can also provide to you a brief history into our relations with Taiwan to really understand how we got to this very rigid attitude towards Taiwan.
That would be very interesting, yes, because this is quite surprising. I mean, there are ups and downs around the EU, but I never heard of such a situation. And beyond the problem of investors, it's quite an inhuman way to treat people. So, yes, if you can tell us, please, the history of the relationship.
Yes, I agree with you totally. And as a matter of fact, we are the only country in the European Union and possibly the only country on Earth that treated Taiwanese people like this in this manner. And I would like to say that whenever I discuss Romania-Taiwan relations, one thing that I like to do is to compare it to the relations Hungary has with Taiwan. And why is that? Well, Romania and Hungary are neighbors. They are both young democracies. They both divorced communism in the 90s. But whereas Hungary took full advantage of its regime change and decided early on in the 90s to open a Taipei trade office in Budapest, Romania's transition to democracy did not bring a major change in its foreign policy towards China and towards Taiwan. And this was part of the reason was because Romania's first democratic leader, Romania's first elected president, Ion Iliescu, was a former communist. And he was an active politician during the Ceausescu regime. So when he became president, he carried over many customs and approaches from that era, including in foreign policy. As a result, Romania remained friendly towards China, and that automatically meant keeping distance from Taiwan. This was not because Romania disliked Taiwan. No, it was because Romania simply accepted Chinese view of Taiwan as a secessionist territory and was afraid to to have any sort of engagement with Taiwan because it would upset China. And you may wonder, why was relations with China so important? Well, there was also the fear of Russia, and some Romanian decision makers at that time believed that keeping good relations with China could offer, in need, some leverage against potential Russian aggression. So that belief back then was understandable, to say so, because Romania was not yet a part of NATO. It became a NATO member only in 2004, and it was not part of the EU. It joined the EU in 2007. So it was a very young democracy. It felt vulnerable, and it was vulnerable, and it needed good relations with powerful states. But after becoming a NATO and EU member, after falling under a stronger geopolitical umbrella, this rigidity of our foreign ministry should have loosened. It didn't happen, unfortunately. It didn't help that Hungary across the border had managed to so successfully and pragmatically pursue economic interests with both China and Taiwan. Romania should have at least looked across the border and should have at least tried to normalize relations with Taiwan from the first day of joining NATO or the EU. But because there was no incentive to change the status quo, no promise of investments, and no strategy whatsoever, we continued with the usual business, with business as usual. And also it depended a lot on who was in power. Traditionally, the Social Democrats, the Social Democratic Party, the biggest party in Romania, has been friendlier towards China, and they held the prime minister office for a lot of years. So whenever they were in power, there were more bilateral meetings with China, there were more MOUs, there were more investment promises. So basically, all this environment led to zero relations with Taiwan whatsoever. And yeah, to conclude, is that Romania's relations with Taiwan is a mere reflection of Romania's relations with China. But as I said before, there is progress. We started to make small changes, but they are important changes. And I am hopeful that our government finally is a bit more open to normalize relations with Taiwan and engage with Taiwan economically.
Well, thank you, Andrea. That was very well developed. Now, there are two things that comes to my mind. One is that you said Iliescu was still pretty much still a communist in his bones, like back to Soviet times, but the USSR was actually not friendly with China for at least 3 decades by the time it fell. The other thing that comes to my mind also, which is interesting, is that Hungary has been governed by Viktor Orban for quite a while, and he is notoriously pro-Russian and pro-Chinese, and yet he has managed to keep a better relationship with Taiwan than Romania did. So, Andrea, Ivana, what would you answer to these two things?
I can go comment on it if that's okay. One thing that it's important to mention is that Romania's strategy on foreign policy is more like this, a strategic ambiguity. We don't like to have enemies. This is what history has shown. We would like, if possible, to maintain good terms with all the strong countries across the globe, regardless of what is the relations between them. Our main threat, the main threat to the national security is Russia, and against Russia we sought any kind of leverage that we could get. And in the view of our leaders in the past, maintaining good relations with China was considered to be that kind of leverage. I believe that this thing should change nowadays, because Romania is part of a bigger group of states of the European Union that has the power to provide the security guarantees to our country, is part of NATO. So we should seek to engage more with this entities, let's say, and help the EU, help NATO become stronger, and engage with other democracies like Taiwan is. And regarding Viktor Orban, it's true that he is now friendly towards China, but that was not the case always. Like in the 90s, he was a China skeptic. He was more bold, let's say, more bold in pursuing ties with Taiwan. He had more democratic views. Things changed, and after the 2000s. So here, Ivana, if you'd like to add something, please.
Yes, of course. Well, the thing is that Central and Eastern Europe is not a monolith. There are a number of countries with very different views, and lots of also change in time. So as Andrea very well said, Viktor Orban didn't start as communist or as, let's say, supporter or admirer of authoritarian regimes. He actually started very much as a communist basher. But the same goes for Serbian leader Vučić as well. So he didn't start on that kind of spectrum. He was actually very much a staunch proponent of his country joining the EU, for example. So many things change, and what probably is good for your listeners to know when they look at the region of Central and Eastern Europe is that for some countries, Taiwan was always special, and that may come in waves, so it still reoccur in time. And here I'm thinking about Lithuania, but also about the Czech Republic. So Taiwan has been seen for the past 30 years as a symbol, as well as Tibet, of a smaller entity which is endangered by possible attack of a big one, especially communist China in this context. And that's something what Central and Eastern Europeans can relate to, because we have the experience of being occupied by Germans, being occupied by Soviets. So that's what relates to what Andrea said, that this basically goes through the local agency and through the prism of looking at international politics with its own historical lenses and the fear of being occupied. So there are different waves in politics. In some countries now, Taiwan is still seen as this symbol, which goes to economy, but also to values, to forge more, let's say, democratic alliances. In other countries, there are currently leaders who realized that it's much more pragmatic and economically more beneficial to play this all-azimuth politics towards both Taiwan as well as People's Republic of China.
All right, excellent. Thanks, both of you, for sharing all these insights. Now I see also when you shared your report with Choice, they also posted this map showing that several countries in the region had over €1 billion of Taiwanese investment, but Romania had only 10 million. So are we hinting at some changes here? It's also mentioned by Choice that Romania needs access to Taiwan's advanced technology for defense modernization. That's the words that they used when they posted your report. Did you witness anything like that? Did you witness future investments coming, especially in defense?
Thank you very much, Julien, for this question. It's an excellent question. As a matter of fact, a very upsetting fact for me is that Romania does not collect any kind of information on Taiwan. So if we ask our national bank or the government, they would tell us that Taiwan doesn't exist, basically. So all the information that we managed to have is via interviews with business people, with Taipei representative office in Slovakia, and with other researchers from reports from other sources. So unless Romania changes its attitude, and there is room for a lot more change than what has already happened with recognizing travel documents, I believe we can remain slightly skeptical that economic relations will develop very fast. What gives me hope, however, is that it is important to look at this issue also at the European level. So across the EU, there is a growing push to strengthen partnership with Taiwan, including through a bilateral investment agreement. So of course, if the European Union signals this strongly, Romania will follow suit. And our decision makers will understand that they need to change their approach. They need to loosen up that rigidity that is inherited from the communist era. And we have a recommendation from the 2021 from the European Parliament that says that we should pursue closer relations with Taiwan because we share values, we have very compatible economies, and we would have many benefits for this. And also, what I would like to note is that whereas Romanian authorities in all of its public answers to any petitions, let's say, or information requests by citizens, by journalists, says that it respects the One China policy and does not maintain official relations with Taiwan. It also says explicitly, and I'm gonna cite this for you, contacts between companies, economic entities, universities, and non-governmental organizations in Romania and Taiwan are not equivalent to official contacts between public authorities and do not contravene to the One China policy. And this is actually a very recent reply that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs gave to some Romanian journalists when they were writing a piece on Taiwan. So this gives me hope that, you know, there is change. We don't see it on the news, but there is change, and I believe that our government is modernizing. I think this is the best way to put it. And also, I would like to point one other thing. Of course, Romania is the second largest recipient of SAFE funding, right? And we have over 16 billion of euros for strengthening our defense system at home. So we should look at Taiwan as at a country that is at the cutting edge of high-tech development, and therefore I believe that a partnership, as I said in my article, would not only be an economic option, but also a necessity for Romania defense modernization. And here I would like to look at Poland, who engages with Taiwan a lot, buys drones from Taiwan, and also I read that they signed a memorandum of agreement, an MOU, providing for joint work on building some non-China supply chains. So I believe we should we should be more open towards Taiwan?
Yeah, I'm thinking a little bit about situation we are currently in as an EU, because Andreea very well said that her hopes are that the EU, the necessity basically to harmonize policy not only on China but also on Taiwan within the EU would somehow lead to an effect that Romania would engage with Taiwan a little bit more. What I do see, unfortunately, on the EU level is quite the opposite trajectory. So we have seen a bit of a consolidation of EU's policy towards China during COVID-19 and more after the Ukraine crisis, and when Russia and China signed this no-limit partnership and announced this no-limit partnership. Since then, for 4 years, a number of things change, especially governments change, with some of the populistic forces rising. And what I do see now is a bit of a split. So on one hand, you have European Commission, which is trying to be tougher on China when it comes to vulnerabilities, trade dependencies, rare earth, and so on, and subsidies as well. And on the other hand, you have a number of member states, especially, but not limited to Western Europe, also in Central and Eastern Europe, who are trying to, how to put it, reach the benefits of free engagement with China. So also limiting their contacts with Taiwan or downgrading the cooperation with Taiwan, or not wanting to make it that official or that visible. So Poland is one case which is very pragmatically basically cooperating with anyone who can help to upgrade their military and secure them from Russia, which is seen as existential threat. So Romania, in that respect, would not be. I think that there is space for cooperation, definitely. So Romania would not be an outlier. Already Poland is doing it. On the other hand, there are countries which are basically saying, as I said, well, we can't provoke China, or we do not want to provoke China, because what if China has some kind of leverage over Russia and can help with the end of war in Ukraine? So unfortunately, there is no unified EU stance on China, and as a result also on Taiwan. It's more of very pragmatic, opportunistic sometimes approach to Taiwan, which may be difficult to navigate for Taiwan and also to understand. If we really talk about Europe as a whole, then on one issue, yes, it is the EU. On the other one, unfortunately, it's the member states who are driving the foreign policy.
It is, yes. Always, I observe that as well, that the EU in general has been consistent in trying to reach out to Taiwan more when it comes to member states. Of course, it's much more varied than that. What I have observed also is that a lot of countries or governments have a tendency to sometimes, yeah, talk to China, try to get some investment, trade deal, etc. But it doesn't mean that actually that they turn against Taiwan. As Andreea said, Romania now has a one China policy, which is pretty standard from most democracies, to basically say, yes, okay, Beijing represents China, but that doesn't mean that we accept its claim on Taiwan. So would you mind going a bit further, telling me what you have observed as problematic from some governments when it comes to Taiwan, really in practice?
Very many things. So there are things which are known to Taiwan and China researchers, but they are not necessarily publicized for general public. And here I'm talking about mill-to-mill cooperation, about sharing information, about selling certain systems. So that, of course, is the primary case of problematic, as you can put it, or the thing which governments are not that much open about. And this is usually the first thing which is cut when the government changes. If you have a more open government, more value-based government, if you wish, and this kind of military cooperation starts, that usually if you have a change of a government, that's the first victim actually of, or scapegoat of cooperation with Taiwan, is this very sensitive kind of cooperation with Taiwan. Then there is a number of other issues which are seen as problematic. For example, parliamentarian visits from Europe to Taiwan and vice versa. But I would like to say that perhaps that eased over the past 6 years. If you do recall, or your listeners do recall, the case of Miloš Vystrčil, the Czech Senate president in 2020, who wanted to travel to Taiwan, and he was a subject of, I would say, brutal political coercion, but he actually persisted and he actually went to Taiwan. And that was the case when it was not usual or normal. So he was seen as an outlier who basically broke this path towards parliamentarians' visits of Taiwan. So now it became a mainstream, but once again, if you have a change of the government or more cautious government, this is usually first thing which once again reappear as a part of not necessarily political coercion, but let's say the government basically signaling to local parliamentarians as well as general public, as well as to China and Taiwan, that parliamentarians are, of course, free to go whenever they want to go, but A, it could jeopardize relationship with China, B, it's not with the blessing of the government, and C, there may be some behind the doors discussions with those parliamentarians trying to persuade them actually not to come. So these are more or less two areas, military one or linked to military, and political one, which are seen as the most sensitive. Usually economic relations, cultural ties, academic cooperation, side organizations, exchanges are seen as less problematic.
If I may add one thing to what Ivana said, I liked a lot her reference to a value-based government, and I would like to elaborate a bit on that. I believe that in this era there is a fight for people's minds, and there is a lot of influence coming through social media, through the media, through some paid journalism, let's say. So I believe it is very important for us to insist on shared values, but not the way China does. In a more, let's say, democratic way and in a more human rights way. So, in Europe, we like very much to talk about European values. Well, Taiwan makes these values that we share in Europe to be universal values, because in 40 years, Taiwan has built not only a highly competitive economy through digitalization and automation, but also a strong democratic system, that ranks consistently at the top in Asia and among the top democracies in the world. So we have a lot to learn from Taiwan, and I believe we should pay very much attention to this narrative of making our choices based on the fears that we have, the fear that China will be upset, the fear that Russia will do something aggressive against someone. I think we should insist more on promoting values and on pursuing close ties, close relations with partners that have excellent education and healthcare systems, a vibrant digital society, freedom of expressions, and an entrepreneurial culture capable of wide-ranging innovation, such as Taiwan is. So, in my view, in the case of Romania, these are areas where we could learn a great deal from Taiwan. I believe we do share similar values: rule of law, human rights, multi-party politics, and the real market economy.
China wants the countries to believe that either having relationship with China or having relationship with Taiwan is mutually exclusive. There's a number of cases which shows that you can very well have some relationship with China as well as have some relationship with Taiwan. So China wants us to believe that this is mutually exclusive, and some of the countries fell into the trap of believing that as well. But perhaps it's better to widen a little bit the horizons and see that the narratives which China is pushing forward are not the only one, the only narratives.
Right, thank you. One thing that I wonder then is what can Taiwan do to improve the situation? How can Taiwan contribute to European countries acting in accordance with their values?
what would definitely work is for Taiwan to be consistent and to be a reliable partner, because at least Central and Eastern European countries had this experience with Chinese promises for 16+1 platform for investment, which in the end almost didn't materialize. So one way to distinguish Taiwan from China would be if Taiwan really stick to its promises of investment and quietly and in a strategic way build its presence over different governments, because governments come and go, right? But the economic realities may stay for a longer time. And that's also one way how to persuade the local population that Taiwan is a good partner. It's a reliable partner who thinks long term and who also brings benefit to local population.
And in the case of Romania, I can continue with this. I believe it is very important to have more people-to-people relations, to have let's say scholarships in partnership with our Ministry of Education. That might be a bit sensitive because it would imply a relation between our Ministry of Education and the Taiwanese Ministry of Education. But I believe that there are ways that we could facilitate more exchanges in the academia, in cultural settings. I believe we could welcome in Romania a department or an initiative to promote Taiwanese culture. We could have programs to stimulate Taiwanese people to come visit Romania, to stimulate tourism. So people-to-people exchanges, I believe, are crucial in order to gain more public support for bilateral relations. From what I observed, Romania is rather friendly towards Taiwan. We do not have a widespread awareness regarding Taiwan, but those who do have a fairly positive opinion towards Taiwan, a better opinion than the opinion on China. Unfortunately, we don't see Taiwan a lot. We don't hear Taiwan a lot. There's not a lot of coverage in the media. I follow Reddit as well a lot, and I want to see what the community is interested about on the Romanian Reddit. And there, I sensed a rather positive take on Taiwan and a rather negative take on China. So, although, let's say, relations with China and with Taiwan don't compete with one another, it is possible that in the public discourse, if not handled carefully, to seem as if these two relations are competing with each other, that you need to choose one or the other, like Ivana said we shouldn't do. So yeah, I would focus on that. More people-to-people interactions, more scholarships, more cooperation in the academia. I would start with that. And also the Taiwanese ambassador in Slovakia visited Romania many times, and he met with professors, with researchers, even with politicians. And I believe he should continue to do that, because although it takes time, in the end, all these efforts pay off. And I'm confident that while there is room for improvements will happen eventually.
Ivana and Andrea, well, thank you so much for being with us today. And yes, let's hope that more Taiwanese will visit Romania now that they are actually able to enter Romania with their passports then.
Yes.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you as well,
No problem.
Julia.
No problem. Thank you very much. Singapore held its biennial air show last week over 3 days. The event carries particular significance for those who follow geopolitics in the region. We spoke with two people who attended the air show. Sasha Chhabra of the Institute for National Defense and Security Research in Taipei, and Elisabeth Gosselin-Malo, a correspondent for Defense News. They described the event for us.
The largest air show in Asia and one of the largest in the world, considered one of the three big air shows, which are some of the industry's biggest events for aerospace and defense exhibition around the world. And Singapore is unique because compared to most of the Western air shows, you get a wide variety of participants from different corners of the world. So it's a very fascinating snapshot in terms of both industries as where they stand in the region. Most of the major contractors have both defense and civilian industries. And of course, there's, a big civilian component, but, what everyone's really interested in, what, the real flexing is about is the defense aspects of the industry. So you can think of this as an opportunity for the US and Western side and the Chinese side. Traditionally the Russians are also there, but, they were noticeably absent this year. But an opportunity for both sides to really display their cutting edge technology and how they want to portray themselves and their defense presence in the future, and of course market themselves to third countries as well. There is the kind of showmanship about this that is important in how first class militaries really view their presence in the world, the opportunity to display not just the hardware they have, but through aeronautics shows too, like the skills of their pilots and what their equipment is capable of doing. So there's a showmanship aspect to it, and there's a commercial aspect to it as well. And I'd say that's generally the case in most air shows, particularly the big three, being Singapore, I think, is the third largest, and after that you have the largest show, Le Bourget in France every 2 years, and Chhabra in the UK.
The air show is Asia's largest aerospace event of its kind. It happens every 2 years. And it gathers countries, delegations, companies, defense manufacturers from across the world into a single space where visitors are given the chance to come in and see arms, weapons, but also commercial assets live. And I think this year they recorded the largest visiting of people across the world. Over 65,000 people came to visit during the week.
Both agreed that drones and unmanned vehicles were a major focus this year.
Unmanned systems and artificial intelligence were, as expected, two important sectors. And that's primarily both a trend within the defense industry, where there's a lot of requirements from different militaries and countries about getting more drones, but it's also from the standpoint of the host country, Singapore. Its military are very interested in introducing more unmanned systems in their units and to use it on a wider scale. So I think currently I spoke to the Air Force chief there, and they said that they're sort of still figuring out how it is exactly they want to use them, how many they need, but they are increasingly looking to Israeli-made systems for that.
So I think what's very interesting this time is, the big focus on drones and AI. Of course, the last several years, UAVs and drones have been very prominent in all air shows. But this year we see even more AI integration than there ever was, and we see a lot of new players coming up, not just in terms of the hardware themselves and producing AI-enabled drones, but you see a lot of marketing of these overall defense systems that integrate AI with all sorts of platforms, right? UAVs, traditional manned ships, manned aircraft, assets that are on shore or on the ground, and trying to create a cohesive security picture. And this is probably an area of unmatched growth, as we're seeing AI affect all industries, but particularly in defense, given how cutthroat the stakes are. It's quite a notable development.
But here is something particularly interesting. Both Sasha and Elisabeth also reported a strong emphasis on countermeasures. It seems drones are not as invincible as one might think. They are not miracle weapons. As they become more prominent, there is growing interest on how to stop them. And it appears that these countermeasures are increasingly effective.
It's much, much easier to counter a UAV than it is to effectively use that UAV offensively. So UAV has been a trend for the last, decade plus. You've seen the explosion of this industry in all aspects, and now, this is you can't talk about aviation without UAVs, and particularly defense. But what you see is now not just the integration of AI into these systems, but you see integration of AI into the anti-UAV systems. And I think one thing I really noticed this year is just the proliferation of how many anti-UAV platforms there are, but also the diversity of them. We've seen in the last few years in the war in Ukraine how central UAVs have been to that war. It's really prompted the development and testing of so many platforms. There's many, many ways of countering UAVs, whether through electronic warfare, directed energy weapons, traditional projectiles, and all sorts of other innovations, using netting and a whole wide variety of options. It has a lot of uses and innovations, but it is also can be very effectively countered. And that's something that all, militaries are going to need to consider when they're thinking about how much they're investing in UAVs, what kind of countermeasures they're investing in, and, the opportunity cost of investing in traditional UAVs versus perhaps some newer technologies. When you look at the Ukraine war and what people are taking away from that, it's just the absolute cutthroat competition between the countermeasures and the offensive measures. And you can really, really see how effective the anti-drone measures are. And that's prompted all sorts of innovations on the offensive side in terms of, using, fiber optic cables rather than wireless signals, and adding more AI for autonomous targeting rather than relying on, external inputs or external navigation systems. But at the end of the day, just from a physical aspect, it's much easier to counter those UAVs. It doesn't mean UAVs aren't essential, but it means that they have a limited offensive capability compared to what you can do investing to defend. And if you're Taiwan, that's good news because you just really have to defend. You don't have to do as much offensive action. It's very different in the Ukrainian context where you have, two, armies really facing up against each other on a flat battlefield, and they're moving back and forth over the same terrain. And of course, Ukraine is trying to recapture its terrain from Russia. It's very, very different when you think about what Taiwan has to do to deter a Chinese attack across the Taiwan Strait.
Singapore and a lot of countries in the regions have struggled, like much of the world recently, especially when it comes to drone intrusions, drone interference or threats to critical infrastructure. And so the role that countermeasures like sensors, radars, preventative measures essentially has grown. It is I would say, more difficult piece of equipment to implement from the standpoint that it's harder to counter these types of threats. They're harder to detect, they're harder to prevent than just a country deploying drones, for example. Countering them requires more coordination between, different units and the country's authorities. But it definitely was something that we were seeing a lot of companies offer on the floor space.
This, of course, carries important implications for Taiwan.
I've worked with a company that I think is doing great work. It's called Tron Future, which is a Taiwan-based company, and they specialize in some of the countermeasures that you just spoke about. Anything from radars to other types of counter-drone systems. Some of them are already in use by the Taiwanese military and help to try to prevent these large-scale drone intrusions and interference. And so at the show, they were showing some of their systems for other countries to also be able to adopt or maybe integrate them. And I know that they're currently doing work on some newer equipment that have to do with AI.
Often made the point that Taiwan's focus should really be on USVs and UUVs. So those are, autonomous drones that operate in the water or underneath the water. And the countermeasures for those remain much more limited and less effective. It's just a different environment in the water versus in the air. So if Taiwan invests in a lot of UUVs and USVs, those are platforms that have a lot more success rate than UAVs, which are much more easily countered. So that's, a trend line you can look at. And beyond that, there are all sorts of other trend lines you can look at in terms of, where militaries are focusing, in terms of how industries are structured, and of course the geographic players, right? So it's not just the United States and China. You have Europeans out there, you have Canadians, you have Brazilians, you have all sorts uh, of actors in these industries, and they're all trying to arm the world. Taiwan is always it's always in a tricky spot with big international venues like this, particularly when the Chinese show up, and particularly in a country like Singapore that prefers to try to always keep its friendship with Taiwan under the rug, like some kind of embarrassment. But Taiwan is there. A lot of the Taiwanese delegations that attended were involved in sort of some of the industry events last week, before the weekend of the grand public show. But there were a lot of not just Taiwanese businesses, but even some, businesses that are based in maybe the US and other countries, but have a large defense relationship with Taiwan that are interacting there, are making deals, are showcasing hardware, are reviewing other hardware. In terms of, the most open Taiwanese presence, you see that on the civilian side, and the opening days of the fair Starlux Airlines, which is Taiwan's third major international airline, showcased their first, actually Taiwan's first A350 aircraft. So nothing as big and splashy as the F-35s on display from the Australians, which are, of course, an American airplane, or any of the other like big major defense platforms. But Taiwan is there, and certainly, even when Taiwan isn't there, all the hardware there is actually relevant to Taiwan, because these are all assets that would be used in a confrontation in the Taiwan Strait.
And last but not least, despite being a major arms manufacturer, Russia was absent this year, and the implications of that absence are also telling.
Countries can have pavilions where a number of their defense or commercial companies are kind of grouped together under one umbrella of the country itself. And in previous editions, here I'm thinking of 2020, 2014, and those years, Russia had a pretty large presence at this air show, meaning that it had its own pavilion. It had defense officials that were there to sort of unveil different products, and they brought along a lot of display models of equipment. And the difference this year in 2024 is that the Russians were completely absent. So there was no Russian companies listed on the roster of attendees. And when you walked around, there was no presence of them. The only sort of reminiscence of that past was the fact that the Malaysian Air Force brought along some of its Russian-made aircraft that they flew during a performance.
I wouldn't read too much into it. I mean, Singapore has participated in the sanctions, the Western-led sanctions against Russia. So, there's that aspect. The Russians are also fighting, most intense war in Europe in generations, and they presumably don't have too many aircraft to spare to send out to Singapore. And of course, there's the likelihood other countries would pull out if the Russians were there. So I wouldn't read too much into it. And I also wouldn't look to Russia in terms of the most cutting edge innovation in this industry, right? We're going to see a lot of interesting developments around AI, UAVs, and all of that coming out of primarily the US and China. And one point I would make is what really interests me is just the sheer proliferation of Chinese SMEs, so that's small and medium enterprises, and particularly dual use ones, right, that are doing a huge amount of defense business, but they're really leveraging their supply chains and the competency and engineering they have from the civilian market. And that's on every aspect of any component that goes into any of this weaponry or any of these platforms, whether they're major or minor. And it's really contrasting with the West, where you see these defense primes that are these massive conglomerates that are, both vertically and horizontally integrated. So they have not too much competition, and they're also vertically integrated by and large throughout their supply chain. What this tells me is that innovation is a lot more expensive on the Western side, and the Chinese have a lot of opportunities to iterate, and through that innovate. And that's something we've seen in Taiwan's development model, and of course has been deployed on a much more massive scale in China. So I think over time we're going to see the Chinese really become innovators of their own and definitely be challenging Western hardware.
On other news around Taiwan, the United States and Taiwan have finalized a comprehensive trade agreement that will cut tariffs on Taiwanese imports and boost Taiwan's purchases of American goods, including energy, aircraft, and industrial equipment. The deal still needs approval from Taiwan's legislature. A bipartisan group of 37 members of the American Congress urged Taiwanese officials to approve a proposed $40 billion defense budget, warning that delays risk undermining Taiwan's ability to counter China's growing military threat. And finally, Taiwan reported a nearly 70% year-on-year increase in exports in January, the fastest growth in 16 years, driven by strong global demand for AI-related semiconductors and tech components. Note that exports to both the United States and China rose sharply. We will meet again next week for a new episode of Taiwan versus the World.